How did the ancient Egyptians use propaganda? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Jackson for a conversation about propaganda in ancient Egypt. How did they use it? Where did it show up? Is propaganda the right word? And how does this matter for us today? Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about propaganda in ancient Egypt. Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today about ancient Egyptian propaganda. We're going to look at two specific examples, but kind of a broad category here, so thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk about the subject, and hopefully you won't mind if I sneak some Mesopotamian stuff in there too.
I'm happy for as much sneaking as you would like.
Yeah,
anywhere you want to go with.
They were just as naughty about it. So
yeah. Well, and if for anyone who's listening and they're like, I would love to hear more about ancient Mesopotamian propaganda. If you're listening the week this comes out, you are in luck because there's a class, an online class that Dr. Jackson is teaching. The link will be down below that you can go and take. It's titled Never Has There Ever Royal Propaganda in Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. So if you're looking for a little bit more after this comes out, go there, register, and you can go and get more from all of this. So can I start with like a defining of terms question for us?
Yes, sure. Such as what is propaganda?
Yeah, exactly. Like, can you contextualize that term within what we're talking about? Like, does the modern idea of propaganda fit well, or do we need to change it when we're thinking in the context of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia?
I think it's both, and I think it is a good idea to think about it in the framework of modern understanding of propaganda too, because it helps us to understand how history still shapes our modern day, which is what the forthcoming class is meant to be about, just to kind of contextualize our modern day within antiquity and antiquity within modern day. Because as people say, history repeats itself and we should be learning from it. But of course, in ancient times, they had their own form of propaganda. They had their own form of rulership. And this is pretty much what we mean in Egyptology and Mesopotamian studies. When we talk about propaganda, it's usually relating to the way kings and queens would represent themselves in art and in text. And it's very very bombastic. I am so great, and let me show how great I am in art, where I am this larger than life character. I'm like 10 times larger than anybody else in the artwork because I'm so important. And we look at these in part as historical documents, but the propaganda part is that it's an exaggeration, that it's there to overemphasize the king's power in text and also in image, and the fact that it's a huge giant monument in stone to preserve for forever this king's power. That's all part of what we mean by propaganda. It's just trying to understand that what we're looking at with ancient art is not necessarily the truth. It's what the kings want you to remember.
Yeah, which when we come to our specific examples, I think that'll be especially helpful as we try to sift through and unpack some of, is there a truth behind the art? Can I ask, I guess, a follow-up with this in thinking of them as these art and texts that are participating in this? Where were these primarily located? Because I think, for me thinking about propaganda today, it's so widely disseminated. It is sent out for everyone all the time. You get it on your phone, on TV, on the radio, anywhere you look, you can get it. Was this similarly accessible, or was the art that this is conveying more refined in nature, or maybe a little bit of both and something different?
Yeah, it is both. One of the huge disparities between then and now is literacy level. So pretty much everybody is literate these days, and as you say, the propaganda is specifically for everybody to ingest. But in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, very few people were literate. This was a gate-kept um, educational practice, and so you couldn't just go up to the monument, wherever it would be, and read what was written on it. So where these monuments were located were sometimes in a public place and sometimes in a not so public place. So you'll find a lot on temples, and not all areas of the temple were accessible to the common people.
Mm-hmm.
There were some designated like public spaces where the commoners could go, and less public spaces where only the priests and the king could go. And a lot of what you might consider as propaganda, it usually pertains to a lot of warfare. And these were images that you would see on the outside of temples. So
Okay.
this might have been a bit more accessible to everybody to see. And so they could kind of get the picture with the pictures, with the artwork that's displayed. Because once we get into the New Kingdom period, we're talking 1500s BC onwards, this is when we start getting like really kind of mural-like compositions. So they really do a great job at telling a story, especially with the art of Seti I and Ramesses II and Ramesses III. These are prime examples of the art telling a story where you don't really need to know what the text is saying. You can just kind of get the gist
Mm-hmm.
based on the motifs that you're seeing in the art. But we also do have, and this is when I want to bring up the Rosetta Stone. We also have documents set up in, just they're set up where everybody can see them. And the Rosetta Stone, we think that this is like one of the most important things on the planet because, for us nowadays it is. It helped us to decode hieroglyphs. This is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But the contents of it, people aren't so familiar with what it's about. And it's basically Ptolemy V patting himself on the back for giving everybody a tax break. That's that's the contents of it. And he had multiple copies of this made. But who's reading this? Nobody. Nobody's reading this. And so it's part of the propaganda aspect is also just knowing what a king can accomplish. You don't have to know the details of it, but if he's setting up this giant granite block of stone to congratulate himself on something that he's done, this is a way for a king to emphasize that he or she is exceptional. And it's more of a show of just continuously telling people, I have the right to rule because I
Mm-hmm.
can do all of these great things. You don't need to know what the great things are, but as long as you understand that, I deserve to be here, this is this is all we need.
Like even removed from understanding the thing, just its presence. Is there
Yes.
a way in which like the inability to understand it furthers its propagandistic value? Like if I'm coming to the Rosetta Stone and I
Mm,
can't read it as someone,
yeah.
does that almost heighten some of the messaging of it versus something that is like that artistic depiction where I can, almost like a cartoon kind of read a version of the scene and participate with it?
That's quite possible, and I think that applies more so to temples. For the Rosetta Stone, it was written in two different languages and three different scripts, and so this would have been like a colloquial Egyptian and then also Greek. And so a lot of people, I think, might have been more familiar with Greek. We're looking at the Delta region where we have the Ptolemies ruling,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Greek presence. And I could be wrong, I'm not a classicist, but there might have been more access to reading Greek, I think. I'm not sure. So maybe more people
Yeah, like
would have been able
literacy
to read
concerns,
this
how
one.
many?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't want to I don't want to cause discourse there. um, but and then we also don't know what happened when they erected the stela. So was there somebody who's reading it out?
Right.
Is there somebody stationed there that can tell you what the contents are? Presumably, when you're having some kind of giant monument installed, I would assume that there would be some kind of event surrounding it. Um, like an unveiling, and
Hmm.
and maybe aspects of it were read aloud. We do know that that Egyptians, they had this very strong belief in magic, and for like healing stela, you might have a priest read the stela aloud to you, and the words of the stela, like that would be imbued with magic, and maybe this would be healing to you. So we do know that there would be instances of people reading to you. Um, Whether this happened with something like the Rosetta Stone or other stelae, we don't know. But I would imagine that there would be some kind of unveiling. But when it comes to um, temple art and text, this 100% had a special meaning just being there. Hieroglyphs
Hmm.
were sacred text. Um, we think of it as they just wrote this as like their everyday writing, right? But this isn't the case. This was a very sacred script, and they would leave this for religious context, like temples and tombs. So there was this kind of like this arcane quality to it, and that did actually emphasize the importance and the awe that you might have. I mean, not that everybody's walking around and saying, "Wow, there's a hieroglyph there." I mean, they weren't doing this. It was commonplace, but yes, I would say that the not fully understanding aspect of that, the mystery, um,
Yeah.
did add something to it. I mean, it's the same with understanding the religion. There were arcane practices and rituals and all of these things that very few people were privy uh, understanding the entirety of it. So, there was in society in general in Egypt, there was this kind of emphasis on not letting everybody know everything.
In a temple location like that, where there might be the presence of the visual art version of propaganda and a written version, and there are things that could be in more public and more private spaces, do the messages kind of match, or does the tone change and the presentation change depending on if we're in that more reserved interior space versus that exterior publicly accessible space?
That is a fantastic question. I love that. And I think a prime example would be Ramesses II. Oh, that guy. He gets away with stuff, let me tell you. Um, yeah, for him, the Battle of Kadesh was in his fifth year of his reign, so this was very important for him. He's a young king. He's got to really prove himself. Um, Historically, we get the idea that he did not win the battle, that it was more of a
Hmm.
they kind of tied, if we're going to be generous. And but he comes home and he's like, yeah, I won this. And um, but the interesting thing about it is he's depicted this battle in six different places. So he was really proud of himself. He was really feeling himself with that one. Um, but there are two different accounts. They're not uh they don't like contradict each other, but we have a short one and we have a longer one. And the longer one,
Okay.
it's very we call this one the poetic format, and the other one is the bulletin one. So the bulletin one is like this kind of short, this happened, this happened, this happened. But the poetic one, we get this more like adventure story, and he really he's portrayed as just he's in the heat of battle by himself, and oh no, the gods have abandoned him, and then in the nick of time, Amun comes in and gives him the power to defeat the enemy. Um, so there is a little bit of that in the text, and you don't get that in the artwork because the art it all I mean in the six different forms we do have some differences in the art, and presumably this is because of different artists, um, and maybe they were just kind of given a a checklist of what to include in
Okay.
the artwork, and then they all kind of have their own little interpretation. But generally, you see something similar in all of them. Um, and there are a couple of really cool inclusions, like in the mortuary temple of Ramesses. This is when we have the Hittite prince who's being held upside down after he's been dragged out of the river. So we have these fun little tidbits like that, but generally you're going to get the same story. So if you don't read the text, you're not going to get those differences with just the kind of more historical recording, if you I
Hmm.
want to put that in quotations, and then you're not going to get that versus the more adventure story that you might find. You'll just get what the pictures are showing you, which is a dramatic scene by itself.
Hmm.
And artistically, it's an impressive composition because it's all over the place. Usually, we're used to seeing Egyptian art as being very structured, but with the Battle of Kadesh, we have stuff happening in multiple different locations. We have people running in opposite directions. There's a pandemonium um, in one little tiny section, and then people are just kind of hanging out in this other section because this is supposed to be when the Hittites surprised them. And so they convey this in the art, and it's very fascinating. So that in itself is monumental, and to look at that, I think in Egyptian would be like, whoa, that's that's a lot of stuff happening there. Um, so I mean, yeah, I think Ramesses is a really excellent example of kind of bending the truth a little bit and picking and choosing where he's going to put different versions of the story. Not that they're all like different, but he
Different
just
flavors
yes, exactly.
of the event. And with him, I guess he's making these different versions. But we also, right, in this instance, have a Hittite side of events as
Yes.
well, or like their version of not the battle, but the peace treaty that emerges from a tie or a stalemate. And so you'd
Yeah.
mentioned, like history in quotes here. If we're trying to come to an idea of events and peace treaty or not and standing, where does that one slide in among the other depictions?
Well, the peace treaty is interesting because it's not a result of the Kadesh battle. It's a result of, it seems, so the king who fought Rameses II was Muwatalli. And we get the peace treaty with the accession of his son Hattusili. So it's kind of like a reestablishment of an alliance, and this happens in
Hmm.
year 21 of Ramesses' reign as opposed to year 5 of the Kadesh battle.
Right.
And you're right, we have two different versions. Um, the Egyptian version, and this could possibly be a matter of what survives versus what doesn't. The original document is written to have been inscribed on a silver tablet and then sent to Ramesses. And then, based on this tablet, he inscribed a monument of this on one of the walls at Karnak Temple. Um, the Hittite version appears in the UN, by the way, in case anybody's in New York and wants to, pop over there and see the Hittite treaty. And I think this is a great way to think of how ancient history still ties into modern day, because we're still using these in political contexts,
Hmm.
interestingly enough. But anyway, the Hittite version is shorter. Um, of course, the Egyptian version has Ramesses putting in all of his fabulous epithets and how fantastic he is, of course. So we get a little creative license on his part. And the Hittite version we have that exists, that survives, is on a clay tablet, a big clay tablet, but clay tablet nonetheless. So we don't have it as this monument, this surviving monument that we have in Egypt. And the Egyptian one, I just last year I filmed it in July, or no, the end of June. It was around this time. Yeah, it was so hot. I was like collapsing from the heat when I was talking about it out there. And it is under the sun. Okay, so this is something that anybody can go and look at. It is
Okay.
um in ancient times, I mean, like ancient Egyptians, common people could have gone
Yeah.
and seen this. So it was front and center. There was nothing blocking it. It was like it was clear. You can go and absorb it. It did have art. It does have art at the very top, which is the typical, God presenting the king with power or whatever it is. I can't remember actually, but it's a very long, impressive document that goes from ceiling to floor. Um, and yeah, so it's longer than the Hittite version. There's more stuff in it, and but we also can compare
Hmm.
the two documents. So one of them is they differ also in like who's the narrator of this document, or who they're referring to. Such as the Egyptian one would say, "Oh, we're dealing with Hattusili," and then the Hittite one would say, "We're dealing with Ramesses II." So we have those kinds of differences. But what's fascinating about it is just what they include in it. And you might think that it's really shocking and interesting and new, but it's actually stuff that we've seen already in the Amarna Letters. And it uses this diplomatic speech referring to each other as brother. And then they have this pact that if one of them needs the other to help them militarily, they will do this. One of the parts that really that I find really fascinating is this extradition clause, where if there's a criminal from the Hittites who escapes from Hattusha or whatever and goes to
Hmm.
Egypt, then the Egyptian king is compelled to send them back to the Hittites for due process and all of that, and vice versa. So they have this extradition agreement, which I thought was fascinating, and I don't know of any other instances that we have this in ancient history. But again, that could just possibly be a question of what survives versus what doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine all of the stuff we don't have, um, unfortunately, just because of survival bias. And what else do they have in that treaty? They have the gods in attendance. So they have a list of gods that are witnesses, and it's both gods. And so that's another interesting thing that we see in the Amarna letters between kings. They greet each other's gods, they respect each other's gods, even if they don't necessarily share worship of these different gods, but they acknowledge the the importance of each other's gods, and that all of them have to be in attendance. It's not the Egyptian gods that are better than the Hittite ones. They
Hmm.
have equal importance, um, which I find really, really interesting. And then it also closes with a curse or a blessing. So if an Egyptian king or a Hittite king does not continue on with this alliance, this treaty, then they'll be cursed. And then if they continue to, uphold the treaty, then they will be blessed in their reigns and all of this kind of thing. Yeah. So
You mentioned the Amarna Letters, which
yes,
are I mean, I guess when I'm thinking of propaganda, I am thinking of these these big public and accessible and visual things.
mm,
But the Amarna Letters are propaganda too. It maybe are they propaganda in a different way, like kind of within the club of the
yeah.
ones receiving them?
I would say so, and there's a lot of passive aggression in them too, which I find
Yeah.
hilarious. It's very petty, especially the Levantine guys. Um, but the kings, such as the Babylonian kings, the Mitannian kings, and at one point the Assyrian king, who tries to get into the club of powers, and Amenhotep III is like, no, who are you? Why are you here? Go away! You're not one of us. Um, but yeah, there's a diplomatic language between them, and they have to be polite. But there's also, when you read it, there's an underlying part of it that is not polite.
Hmm.
Um, and the other issue with the Amarna letters is we, for the most part, only have half the story. We don't
Right.
have largely any of the letters written from the kings to, like, from Amenhotep III or Akhenaten to the other kings or vassals. We don't have those except occasionally, and then we'll have some reference to letters that are sent. But with the Amarna Letters, when I do the class, what I want people to think about is that we shouldn't take them at face value. So, for instance, you have my favorite king. My favorite king is Tushratta of all time. I love him so much. He's the king of Mitanni. Poor guy. He was murdered by his son, and then lost his entire empire, obviously, because he was murdered by his son, and then his son defected to the Hittites, who took over the Mitannian kingdom. But he would constantly write to Akhenaten saying, "Your dad promised me a bunch of statues, and you haven't sent them to me." So when we're reading this, we're thinking, oh, he's not being very fair. Akhenaten is not being very fair to Tushratta. But what we're not thinking about is the other half of that story. Because we don't know what Akhenaten was doing or not doing. Because already Amenhotep III, who was sending statues to Tushratta, he was not doing a very good job of giving him what he wanted. We do have some letters or a letter from Tushratta telling Amenhotep III, "You just sent me these plated ones. I want solid gold statues. You sent me plated gold." And that's why he keeps coming back to Akhenaten saying, "Your dad promised me all of these things." Did he though? And in one of his letters to Akhenaten, he is basically yelling at him. He's saying, your grandfather was the first one who like really united with the Mitannians, and then I was really good with your father, and your father was so great with me, and you're not doing half the things that your father is doing for me. When really Amenhotep III was not doing all of the same things that Tushratta was saying that he had done. So we have this kind of passive aggression between them where you have to uphold this diplomacy, and it is very shaky, because we do have a history of the Mitannians and the Egyptians as major enemies. And so, in ancient times, I feel like any diplomatic relationship, it's so easy to break it. And so that's why they have to use this kind of language. And so this isn't necessarily a propaganda, because propaganda does have to be a bit more public, I would say.
Okay.
But I also think that there is an element of it between kings where they have to kind of make a show of their own power to another king to make sure that they can maintain this diplomacy, to make sure that the other king can kind of respect their power, maybe even fear it a little bit. Because if you're not, if there's no threat, then why are you building an alliance, right?
They still draw on some of that, some of the same way they externally message to people, and in this way, not for public consumption, but I still want you to get the message that I am this big and powerful king as well. Like, don't you forget that these things can happen to you too.
Exactly. Yes.
Interesting.
Precisely.
Turning to some of the Levantine boys, as I think you would call them, and talking about diplomacy falling apart. The Battle of Megiddo as another one of these examples where we had diplomacy, and then with the changing of powers, some things change. A battle takes place that presents, I guess, another one is, because I want to ask about this one, both for itself, but then also to loop back to some of the descriptions you talked about before with Ramses' depiction of himself after his battle. So could you set the stage a little bit for us about that battle, and then some of how we have any accounting of this, whether it's historical or otherwise?
The Battle of Megiddo, yes. This was during the reign of Thutmose III. He started this campaign in the 22nd year of his reign, when he started ruling in his own right because he was hanging out with Hatshepsut for a while, you know. Um, and so this was kind of his way to establish his prowess, his strength as a king and as a military man. And so what do? When you really want to make that show, you have to do something big. You can't just, have a little skirmish out in the eastern desert. No, you have to go out and make an impact. And he definitely did that with the Battle of Megiddo. So we don't have any kind of pictorial representation of this. We have it only in text format. And the primary version of this is the Annals of Thutmose III on Karnak in the Temple of Amun. And during his reign, this would have been a bit more prominent, but then as Karnak, more kings added to the Karnak complex, it became less visible, and now it's kind of blocked by a 25th dynasty chapel or sanctuary or something. But even so, people would not have been able to read it. So it's like, who was the audience here? Certainly wasn't the common people. The image that does accompany the text is this gigantic collection of votive objects that were left that were donated to the temple, presumably following the battle. It doesn't specifically say that these were the looted goods that they brought back home. So it seems that the audience would be Amun himself. So it's really, really interesting that they didn't have a pictorial representation, unless it just doesn't survive. Maybe it was painted and we don't have that. I don't know. But it would be really cool if we found one, because it's epic. It is epic, but
it is surprising there is no pictorial, because it is such a big battle, and it is important for the power dynamics of the region. That it gets held it's placed where it does, where it is, and text only, which when we talked about before of, who's engaging with this, can I ask too, like, who's recording this? Because we have who's going to be able to participate, but we have, like, what hand does this come from to even exist in the way that it does?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we do have an answer to that. He brought scribes with him to record what they were seeing. So it appears that we are getting first-hand accounts, which were probably then edited by the king, naturally. But he did bring people to record it. So, they weren't just going off their memories. They were sitting there with their papyrus, or maybe clay tablet or something, probably a papyrus, writing in hieratic very quickly, just all of the crazy stuff that was happening. It was pretty fast, this battle. It took longer to get there than it did for the battle to happen. And another reason why it's interesting that we don't have a pictorial representation is because, Hatshepsut was very conscientious of displaying really incredible moments from her reign, such as the journey to Punt, where they bought incense and imported baboons. So we have this depicted on her mortuary temple. The other issue is we don't have Thutmose III's mortuary temple that survives very well. So presumably there would have been some artwork there, but it doesn't survive very. It's like rubble, essentially. But it was architecturally modeled after the Temple of Hatshepsut. So it could just be a matter of it doesn't survive, and it did exist, but we just don't have it anymore. I hope we'll get it one day, because one reason why it's so popular among scholars is because we get this really interesting explanation of military tactics. Yes,
it's such a
Yeah,
visual description of the battle
it is.
that
It is.
it
It
feels
is.
ripe for images to accompany.
It does, and it's very fascinating because he seems to be quite proud. I'm sure, I mean, I would be too if I was him. Um, because what happens is for people who aren't familiar with this battle, he marches um from the Delta into the Levant region. He stops at Gaza and then he moves on to another city and then he sets up camp for a little bit and then he brings his officials, his generals, to converse with them about their ideas on how to approach the city Megiddo, because it's hard to approach it um, and be protected at the same time because it's couched within this mountain system and it's raised. So
Hmm.
this is not a city that's easy to take. You don't just go in there and be like, all right, we got this. No, it's elevated. There are walls, um, and this is you have to lay siege. So how do you reduce the siege time, right? Um, because if you can reduce that and then just attack them, it's a whole lot easier to take a city if you have fewer people defending it. So according to the story, he gathers around his officials to discuss what can happen or what they can do. So there are these three different mountain passages, and they know that the people at Megiddo are stationed at the north and south passages, but not the middle one, because the middle passage it's very narrow and very few people can walk abreast through there, and the passage would be very slow if you have chariots, which they had. So they had to break down the chariots and carry them, so they couldn't just drive there. And so Thutmose III was betting on the people at Megiddo, not expecting him to take this narrow passage because it was kind of a dumb idea.
Hmm.
Anybody would think this is really stupid. It's easy to ambush them and just like, pick them off one by one. Um, but he says, no, this is what we're gonna do. And then he leads the army. He's the one in the front. So this is when you have to kind of raise your eyebrow and think, is he though? Is he really
Yeah.
leading the column? Because that's not smart. um,
Yeah.
so, we have this kind of, I mean, maybe he did, I don't know. But you do have to kind of sit there and this is when you have to, sit there and question how much of it is truth, how much of it is exaggeration, um, and, just try not to take it at its word that this is exactly what happened, because again, this is a king who wants to prove
Hmm.
himself. This is one of his, first solitary battles as a king. It's a major battle. This is something he's got to record. So he has to be, smart about how he's going to represent himself when he gets back home. But
Yeah.
yeah, according to his story, he leads them through this narrow passage, and it's a success. Nobody's waiting for them. The Megiddo people are on north and south sides, um, and so they can just kind of leisurely come in, set up camp, take a rest, take a couple of days. um, and then we do know that the people who remained in Megiddo, they're watching this happening, right? They're probably on their walls and they're seeing the Egyptians coming through. Oh my God, what are we gonna do, you guys? Come back, come back. Um, so there's probably pandemonium in the city. And but Thutmose III, he gets to have a nice break. But then they do meet for battle in the morning, and so they're advancing on three different. So he divides his army into three different. I think it's three different groups, and then so you have his. He's leading the center and attacking the people of Megiddo, the army of Megiddo from the center, and then he's got these two groups that are coming in from the flank. So people, the army, the Megiddo army, um, panics, and then they break and they start fleeing back to the city. Um, except they've closed the doors. They've closed the gates to the city. They can't get in. So then they start hauling up the army. They start hauling up the soldiers with bed sheets over the walls because the gates are closed. And it's just this hilarious image that you're getting. Um, but again, part of this is also a little bit of this is also propaganda because we have a
Hmm.
history of Egyptian kings trying to portray enemies as weak, as
Right.
easily routed, right? We get this very interesting picture of this on the Semnestila of Senwosret III when he's fighting the Nubians. He says that they're really bad at war. They don't follow the rules. Um, so there's this long history of Egyptians trying to portray their enemies as being unworthy. Um, However, I think that's a little bit too specific,
Okay.
a thing
Yeah.
to think didn't happen, right? I think it's a little too specific to say
It's a
they're hauling them
pretty
up over the
particular
walls with
jab.
sheets.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
In his description, because that battle takes place before the Battle of Kadesh that we talked about before.
Yes.
In the depiction that we get from Ramses, in the way he is portraying himself and his battle, does he draw anything from what had been, again, just the textual representation? But as you mentioned, he in Megiddo, he says to be in the front. And so if we're
Yes.
looking at Kadesh with like his depiction of himself, is he drawing on like old propagandistic ideas of, hey, you've heard about these stories before, and modeling himself on some of that material?
Not directly. Um, I think this format it's a motif. So
Okay.
it's an established motif in the art and in text, for the king to kind of be the superhero. So for Ramesses II, his moment of glory in the Battle of Kadesh, because the really interesting thing about that story is, we get a king that is caught unprepared. That's new. So it sets him up for being really heroic when he finds himself uh, cut off from the rest of his army. So again, for people who aren't familiar with the Battle of Kadesh, um, Ramesses marches with four factions. He's got four groups in his army, and he marches ahead because he gets they capture these scouts, and these scouts tell him, "Oh yeah, the Hittites, they're not here yet. They're so far away." When in secret they're hiding behind the town, waiting to ambush him. So Ramesses thinks, "All right, we've beaten the truth out of them. How could they possibly be lying to me?" So his yeah,
Never would
his
do that.
army is, yeah, right. I mean, the audacity. Um, so he brings his first faction outside the city. They set up camp, and that's when they get attacked by the Hittites. So he's taken unaware, um, and that's really fascinating. But I think one of the reasons why he's not trying to argue that that didn't happen is because this is a moment for him to show how quick he is on his feet, where he says, "Okay, you guys got to go
Ah,
quick. Tell the rest of the army to get their butts moving." Um, and then it also allows him to be cut off from the rest of his army to have his moments of glory when he's surrounded by all of these enemies. He's afraid he's going to get killed. He's calling upon
right.
the god Amun saying, "Why are you not helping me out?" And then Amun comes in and he helps him out, and then he single-handedly defeats an entire swath of enemies, um, like with one arrow, that whole story. Um, and so it is one of those motifs that you find in Egyptian literature, just trying to show the king as being, like, nobody comes anywhere close to being as powerful and as divinely, um, what's the word? Divinely supported as the
Hmm.
king is. So he's got these like magical powers as well.
Yeah, and and uses that moment of like what could be a moment of failure to set up, which feels interesting comparing that with Moses being the one that's like, I take your advice and I'm going to make the decision and this is the way. And look, that leads to my moment of glory. Whereas here, it's a bad decision that leads then to a moment of glory, which is a fascinating pivot on how you
lose.
Portray yourself. Because it feels like the thing you would cut out or you would expect them to cut out, but becomes essential for the message.
Exactly. And it's fascinating. And you kind of get this idea that he's in a way trying to humanize himself just so that he can reestablish his divinity, because kings were divine beings, or semi-divine in life and then fully divine after death. Unless you're Amenhotep III and then you're a god. You make yourself into a god while you're still alive. But yeah, there's a literal no-lose situation when it comes to ancient Egyptian kings. Even when they lose, they're like, no, we won that one. Look at these lessons we've taken back.
You heard a bad report. That's not the message. I guess on that note, were these messages, the depictions of battles, whether they're artistic or textual, do you think they were understood to be propagandistic by the Egyptians consuming them? Because we've been using like historical record in quotes when we're talking about the depiction of the battle. Does it seem like they engaged with it with a similar skepticism?
That's really not something we can know, unfortunately. But I think it's easier for us today to look at it as propaganda, because when you have the benefit of hindsight, you can see a lot more. But if it's happening, in front of you, like you're living through it, it's not always apparent, because when we look at ancient Egypt, we can see all of it. We can see all of the 3,000 years in front of us. But they couldn't, right? They could only see their own lifespans. And so that's, things happen on a much smaller, or much slower scale. You can think of it that way. Also, we have thousands of years of them doing this. So this is kind of like their everyday life.
Right.
So it's easy for us now to look back and point that out. Whether or not, Egyptians were smart. Obviously, they built really impressive things. They were very creative people, very capable of all manners of education. And so, I'm not trying to suggest that they didn't have any self-awareness, but it really is not something that we can know. It's possible that some did, it's possible that a lot of them did, and it's possible that some or a lot didn't. It's not something we can guess. I think we can only compare it to ourselves now, and just consider it as the general human experience. How aware are we today of propaganda in our own time, which is another reason why I decided to put this class together, because it allows us to think about how this can compare to our current era, or just recent past, or even think about what we might experience in the future based on current events or whatever.
Yeah, I do think it's a very timely class. So if you're interested in learning more about some of what you've heard today and much more, right? The class is Never Has There Ever, Royal Propaganda in Ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia with Dr. Jackson. It's going to be this weekend if you're listening to this podcast, the week that it comes out. The link is down below. It's with Save Ancient Studies. So if you're looking for a weekend activity and some way to get some more information, I highly recommend going and checking it out. Dr. Jackson, thank you for coming to walk through what we can break apart about some of this ancient Egyptian propaganda. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I loved it. It was brilliant.
Remember to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, that's all we have for you. For everyone here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.